to the Profits on Purpose podcast, where we normally explore the journeys of purpose-driven founders and the financial strategies that have helped them survive. Guys, I'm your host. My name is Nate Littlewood, and today's guest is someone a little bit different. Most of you would know that most of the guests on here are usually founders of CPG and e-commerce brands, and they're deep in the trenches of scaling their physical product businesses. Today's guest is not that. He is not scaling a D2C brand or managing any inventory at all. So you might be asking, what the heck is he doing here? And why did I make an exception? Guys, today's guest is a gentleman by the name of Kris Kelso, who is a keynote speaker, an executive coach, and the author of a book called Overcoming the Imposter. This is a book that has helped thousands of high-achieving professionals rethink the way that they relate to self-doubt. And folks, I have a confession to make. I am one of those people that Kris has helped. I actually had a coach recommend his book to me last year while I was dealing with a particularly troublesome phase of imposter syndrome. And Kris's book helped me navigate through that phase and get unstuck. He and I randomly struck up a conversation a couple of months ago over LinkedIn, and that's essentially how this conversation today has come about. So Kris has worked with entrepreneurs, executives, and creatives across numerous industries. He's spoken at events all around the world as well. And he's on a mission here to help leaders reframe imposter syndrome, not as a weakness, but as a signal of growth. Kris, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Nate. I'm so glad to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Absolutely. Well, Kris, you've reframed imposter syndrome as the imposter, a voice that shows up for high performers. Can you walk us through what that voice actually sounds like and how it might be sabotaging people who, from the outside, might look like they're thriving and everything's going fine?
Yes, there's so many of us that have that narrative in our head, that little voice that wants to try to convince us that either our success isn't real or the people that admire us and respect us don't really know the full story, or it tells us that we don't know what we're doing, we're at risk of embarrassing ourselves or making some huge mistake, and it's often trying to hold us back. It's trying to keep us playing it safe. And as I learned about imposter syndrome, because I wrestled with this as an entrepreneur for almost 2 decades now, and have had my own bouts of self-doubt and that voice in my head telling me that, man, you're just one mistake away from being exposed as the fraud that you are because you've just gotten lucky all this time. And as I started to study this phenomenon and this kind of psychological battle that goes in our heads, I gave that voice a name, and I call it the imposter. Not just because it's trying to convince me that I'm an imposter, which it sometimes is. It's trying to tell me that I'm a fraud and I don't really know what I'm doing. I just know how to sound like I know what I'm doing. But it really, I gave it that name to remind myself that that voice isn't real, that there's nobody there, that it's just a mind trick. And also to remind myself that that voice will masquerade as wisdom and prudence and sometimes even as humility. But it's not those things. It's self-doubt, and it's holding me back if I listen to it, if I give in to those fears that it's preying on.
Wow. So it sounds like the imposter actually does quite a good job of convincing us that it's real and it should be listened to. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, the imposter sounds different for different people. It's funny. I've had a lot of people, as they've read my book or heard one of my talks, they come tell me about their own voice of self-doubt. And I one time had someone say, my imposter is a litigating attorney. And so everybody's voice of self-doubt shows up in a unique way just for them. And that's part of what makes it so so powerful is the voice inside your head will say different things to you than the voice in my head is saying to me. And it'll craft a message of doubt that's very unique and very specific because the voice in your head knows all your insecurities. It knows all of your perceived weaknesses. It knows all the times that in your life when you really didn't know what you were doing and maybe you were faking it a little bit. And it'll try to capitalize on all those things that nobody outside of your head could ever do.
Yeah, so interesting. So I guess as an entrepreneur or founder, I mean, there's so many times where we kind of have to put on this show and pretend to the rest of the world that we've got our you-know-what together, everything's fine, could be talking to investors or employees or maybe, retail partners. Is it even possible to avoid the imposter when this is essentially what your job and so much of what you're required to do for your profession is just figure it out?
Yeah, I'm always hesitant to say it's impossible or to say that 100% of people experience this because the data doesn't quite hold that up, but it is very prevalent among high achievers. I mean, studies say 70 to 80% of the population and even higher percentages among high achievers experience self-doubt and some form of imposter syndrome at some point during their career. And I think you talking about entrepreneurs, you've hit on one of the reasons why it is so prevalent is entrepreneurs are almost always in sales mode. They're either pitching their business idea or their product idea to potential customers or to potential investors if they're trying to raise money. They are pitching potential employees and team members who they want to join them. They're just vision casting all the time. And they know that the vision that they're casting and the product that they're proclaiming, that there are some things in there that they don't really fully know yet, that there are some assumptions and even some guesses, and that there are some flaws and cracks that they're still trying to work out because that's part of the entrepreneurial journey, right? We create something from nothing. We build things and we unleash them on the world and we have to figure it out along the way. And so that combination of sort of really being in sales mode and trying to present the very best version of yourself while also learning on the fly and figuring it out as you go and always kind of being just a little bit in over your head, that is a recipe for a lot of self-doubt.
Yeah, interesting. So entrepreneurs are always, testing new boundaries, doing things that oftentimes they haven't done before. So it makes sense that we're naturally putting ourselves into situations and in environments where we're going to be encountering this more than, the average person compared to someone who's doing, the same thing day in, day out. It's like, okay, I've done this 1,000 times before. If you had a standardized job like that, I guess it would be a lot less prevalent. I wanted to ask you about the comparison trap. In a world of social media and pressure on how we should be performing and looking, and, it's so easy to kind of look around and benchmark ourselves to our competitors, our peers, and so forth. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the role of comparisons and, benchmarking ourselves to others and how that plays into all of this?
Yeah, it's a really tricky proposition to compare yourself to others because on one hand, it is important to learn from other people, to observe what others are doing and to look at yourself and be reflective and evaluate how can I be better. And yet, if you try to value yourself or rank yourself or compare your journey against someone else, it's almost always a false comparison because the truth is that you don't know somebody else's full story. You only see the parts of it that many times that they want you to see, especially on social media. Social media is such a highly filtered and curated version of somebody's story. And I'm not trying to call people out or saying that people are intentionally deceptive. It's just sort of the reality of it is you only see and hear what they want you to see and hear. And so when you're comparing yourself to someone else, you're almost always comparing the reality of your life to a very polished and filtered version of someone else's life. And it's just not real. And that can create all kinds of problems, because when you see others, you know, that seem to be just crushing it, they seem to be doing great. And again, going back to entrepreneurs, this is where that always being in sales mode compounds itself, because you see other entrepreneurs in sales mode and they look like they're killing it. They look like everything is awesome. And you know that your own story has a lot of struggle and a lot of challenges and setbacks. And so it's easy to feel like everyone else is moving a lot faster than I am. Everyone else is doing much better than I am. But it's because the comparison trap, and I call it a trap because it really is a trap to try to rank yourself against someone else when you don't know the full detail of someone else's story.
Totally. I've actually got an interesting example of this that I'd love to run by you. I'm putting you a bit on the spot here, so apologies for that. But as I think you know, I used to be an e-commerce founder. And a few years back, I was, you know, deep in the weeds of running my brand. And I would, you know, do a lot of the things that you just described. I would look around at my competitors, you know, I was following them all on Instagram, and they had it way more figured out than we did. Like, they had much bigger social media accounts. They were growing, huge engagement. I was like, man, why can't I do that? That's so annoying. And I felt really bad, like, because I didn't feel like I was doing a good enough job to keep up with these folks. But here's where the story gets interesting. So at around the same time, there was a period of a year or two where almost all of my competitors did an equity crowdfunding campaign. I'm not sure if you've heard of these, but there's platforms like Start Engine and WeFunder and so forth. Anyway, one of the requirements for raising on these platforms is that you have to publish 2 years of your financial statements.
Yes.
So you get 2 years of profit and loss and 2 years of balance sheet. Now, me being the finance nerd I am, I dove into all of these reports, looked at their financial statements, and these guys who I'd been kind of idolizing up until this point, I saw what was really going on in their numbers, and I was going, oh my God, like, I'm glad I'm not them anymore. And it actually made me feel so much better about myself when I realized that these people, or brands rather, that I had been, you know, idolizing up until this point, their reality was quite different, you know, behind the scenes.
Yeah, that is exactly the kind of experience that I've had a couple of different times, and even in different scenarios with, you know, getting to know a little bit about someone's personal life and realizing that while their business is successful, their personal life is a wreck because they've made so many trade-offs and sacrifices, and I don't want to get to that place. And so I've had several experiences like that where you get a peek behind the scene and you realize, oh man, this is not all what it seems. And all of this beating myself up, all of this guilt or shame that I've been feeling, all of this, you know, being down on myself for not being as far along as them has been for nothing. It's been a bunch of wasted effort and energy. It's been, you know, a bunch of just unnecessary emotional baggage. And so that is when I really came to this idea of the comparison trap. And I said, we can learn from one another, certainly, and we should look at what competitors are doing and see what's working in the market. But the moment you start stacking yourself up against someone else, you are almost 100% of the time setting yourself up against a false comparison. And it's not fair to you, and it's not helpful to you, because you're not really looking at the truth. You don't know the truth.
So if this is indeed a trap, and we shouldn't be comparing ourselves to our competitors, who should we be comparing ourselves to?
This is a great question. And I thought about this for a while, and I said, you know what? The only person that I need to be better than is me yesterday.
Yep.
I'm on a unique journey as an entrepreneur, as a father, as a husband, as all of the different roles and things that I am. I'm on a unique journey that's a little bit different from anybody else. There may be some that are similar, but none are exactly the same. And so I need to be thinking about, where am I now, and where do I want to be, and what kind of progress am I making towards my goals, towards my purpose, towards my passions, towards the things that are important to me. And as long as I'm better than I was yesterday, as long as I'm making progress forward, then nobody else's journey really matters. They don't factor into the equation of whether or not I'm successful. And that has really become my definition of success is, am I living out my purpose? Am I making progress? Am I growing? Am I learning? Am I stretching? Am I doing new things? And am I fulfilling my passions and enjoying the things that I'm involved in? That's the definition of success for me, and it doesn't involve anyone else.
Yeah, that really, really resonates with me. So as I think you know, I now work with early stage founders in the e-com and CPG space. And one of the things that one of the conversations I find myself having very often is, around the financial improvement and performance of the business. And I've got this kind of example I go through, which I call the 5% situation, right? Let's say we find 3 different ways to improve the financial performance of your business by 5%, increase net profits by 5%. One of them is to do with getting better at marketing and media buying and, creative ad strategy. The next method is you could improve profits 5% by focusing on supply chain or engineering of your product. And then the final strategy could be about, refinancing the business and, looking into debt or equity or something or other. And what I say to founders is, listen, you only have a very, very small talent pool to pull from. You've got a small team. You're good at a small number of things. Like, you don't have an Amazon-sized talent bench to pull from here.
Right.
So what we need to do is we need to figure out which of these opportunities or projects are best aligned with your unique talents and interest. Don't worry about what the other guys are doing. Just because they're growing their business by pursuing, this particular marketing strategy. If you don't have the competencies and skills to do that, you're probably not going to be, successful if you try to mimic, their approach. But if we can define a strategy that's unique to you and that you and only you can excel at and execute really, really well, then you're now in, a competitive pool of one. Like, no one else is going to be able to pull that off the way you can. So a big part of what I do when I'm working with my founders is try to understand, like, what are their unique strengths and what are the parts of the business that they can really, really excel at. And I say, I want to put the balls in front of you that you can kick into the goal, right? It's no use me putting a bowling ball in front of you, asking you to kick it and you breaking your toe. That's not going to help anyone. So, we need to find the right opportunities for each and every person. So just wanted to throw that in there as a little anecdote. But I guess going back to what you were saying about, comparing yourself to yesterday and gradual improvement, it sounds like if we were successful at doing that and we could convince ourselves that every day that we're getting a little bit better, does that mean that we can eventually, cure the imposter or imposter syndrome? Like, does it go away, or is this something that we're going to be dealing with for, a long time, or, perhaps our whole lives?
Yeah. Like many things, the answer is yes and no. It's a little bit situational. And so one of the things I realized as I was studying imposter syndrome, again, I started digging into this originally for myself, right? I was solving for me and then solving for some of my friends and colleagues and clients. And I realized that one of the ways that you cure imposter syndrome is to avoid it, to stay away from anything that threatens your confidence, to stick to what you're really good at, to do the same thing over and over again. And you kind of mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that there are people who don't wrestle with self-doubt because they just sort of do the same thing day in and day out, and they get it on lock, and they are satisfied with putting it on repeat. And eventually you master what you're doing every day and you just keep doing it. And that's one way to approach life. But I discovered that and people like me, people that are explorers and who like to push the boundary and who like to grow and try things new, the entrepreneurial minded people, creators, they're just not satisfied with that. And so they're not comfortable with mastering one thing and doing that for the rest of their life. And so what I discovered is in some areas of your life, you can develop a level of confidence and mastery where the imposter doesn't really have much strength in your mind. The imposter doesn't have a lot of ammunition to throw at you to try to convince you that you're just faking it, or you're still figuring it out, or you don't know what you're doing. But as long as you're continually trying something new, as long as you're trying new things and you're getting outside your comfort zone, which people like me are always doing, I'm always learning something new. I'm always adding something to my portfolio of work or life or activities. If I'm not learning, I'm not enjoying myself. And so that continual learning means I'm always in some area outside my comfort zone, in over my head, etc. And so that's one of the reasons that my book is titled Overcoming the Imposter. Present tense, continuous, ongoing activity, because it's not a one-time event. It's not a battle that you fight once and you win it and then you're done. It's an ongoing practice, and really it's a set of habits, a set of disciplines that help you to battle self-doubt every time it pops up, which again, for someone like me, is frequent because I'm always getting myself into new situations and trying things new and getting outside of that comfort zone.
Interesting. I'd like to run something by you here. As I think about what you were just saying in terms of testing comfort zones, and, it's part of the DNA of what entrepreneurs do.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned before, this was something that I was struggling with big time last year, and going to open up a little bit here and share what was going on. So I was in the early stages of building what is now Future Ready CFO, right? My CFO consulting business. And I had come into this as someone who'd spent nearly a decade on Wall Street. So I was confident in the finance things. I knew numbers and financials as well as anyone else.
Yeah.
And I'd spent 6 or 7 years as a, moderately, mediocrely successful e-com founder, right? I did okay at it, but I'm not going to BS you here, Kris. I didn't exactly hit it out of the park. So anyway, I'd never actually been a CFO before in my life. All I'd basically done is Venn diagrammed this and said, okay, there's finance, there's being a founder, let me overlap them. I don't know, maybe I can help founders as a CFO. And, I'd never been a CFO before in my entire life. And here I was suddenly trying to sell CFO services to, people that were candidly more successful than I'd ever been as an entrepreneur. And I'm then, turning around, trying to coach and advise them. It was about this time that I read your book. And I'm not sure if it was because of your book or not, but one of the things that I did, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this kind of as a strategy, is I think I'd made the mistake of basically copying the template or the scope of work that all the other CFOs were using. And, I'll be frank, I'd never been a CFO at a big e-commerce company before, and I felt like a little bit out of my depth. But the thing that really helped me was actually kind of retreating a little bit back from saying, hey, I'm a hardcore pure CFO, and identifying what was really unique and individual about me. And I was like, yes, I understand the numbers and I understand them just as well as anyone else. But you know what? I'm also a former founder and I know what it's like to be in the thick of it. And I've since, I guess, repositioned myself when I'm talking to clients as more of a, like a co-founder on demand. So yes, we can get into the group, nitty gritty weeds of the numbers if you want, but you also need someone who actually knows what it's like to be in your shoes and can help you make the tough day-to-day decisions. Now, I guess the reason I'm mentioning all this is because I feel like I kind of retreated a little bit from testing the bounds of what was unfamiliar to me. I came back to something that I was more familiar with, came back to a place that was more comfortable to me. And I kind of used that, I think, to recharge my self-confidence and, boost myself up. And now what I do is I kind of go on campaign. So I come back to my core. I know I can excel here. I know I can do this thing and I can do it really well. Now I'll have a sprint and then I'll, spend a week or two doing something that's unfamiliar where I don't have as much confidence. but then I can come back to this thing that I know that I'm good at. What are your thoughts on that as a strategy or approach to dealing with this?
Yeah, it's an interesting way of looking at your situation, and I think there is some wisdom in sort of building a base of confidence, something you understand and you feel really competent, and then building on top of that some experiments, some trials, some things you're going to add, a skill set you're going to develop. But you're not 100% operating in the new and the unknown. You're 60, 70% in a very familiar and confident space. And then you're adding, I'm going to try something here and I'm going to see what I learn. You know, one of the things that the mantras that I've developed about trying new things is that failure is only truly failure if I learn nothing. And so as long as I'm learning, even if something doesn't work out the way I wanted it to, I'm gaining ground. I'm making progress. It may not be exactly the progress that I thought I was going to get because it didn't go the way that I hoped it would go, but I got something out of it. And so what I hear you saying is, I'm not going to put all of my eggs in that succeed or learn basket, where those are the two possible outcomes. And if I learn, that may be great, but it might not exactly, you know, line my wallet or pay the bills. But I'm gonna build a base where I'm confident and I know I can be effective, and then I'm gonna add on top of that some of these experiments where some of them are going to pay off and I'm going to do great things that maybe I wasn't even sure I could do. And that's awesome. And others are going to be a learning experience that I'm going to have to do some trial and error. And I'm going to have to take a step back and reflect and evaluate and try again, or even reevaluate whether it's worth trying again.
Yeah, totally. Actually, this was a mindset shift that I picked up from you, was about reframing the metrics of success. So I'd observed myself falling into a trap a little while ago. I was trying this new, marketing technique strategy thing where basically hosting webinars, right? About, it's a 1 hour workshop webinar about some, finance related topic. And the first couple of times I did this, I'd had, let me take a step back. I'd hoped that I'd have a full house and there'd be, 20, 30, 40 people there. But the first time I did it, I'd had like 10 people sign up. And when I launched the first webinar, there was one person who logged on. A little while later, I had 2 people logged on. And it was absolutely terrifying. I'd gone into this thinking, hey, this is going to be this great big event. I'm going to get all these people and, maybe there'll be some new business opportunities come out of it. And I realized I was completely overwhelming myself and thinking about the wrong metrics for success. And when I reframed it and thought, this is not going to, make me millions of dollars. There's probably not going to be a whole lot of people here. Really, all I'm trying to do here is learn.
Yes.
And I want to make mistakes because every embarrassing mistake I have is going to teach me a valuable lesson. And you know what? I've now done a few of these webinars and they're getting better and better. And there's actually starting to be a few more people showing up. And, I'm enjoying it more and I'm feeling so much more relaxed about it. And that all came from, this insight, which I picked up from you, which is just reframing the metrics of success, which is super, super powerful.
Yeah, there's some relationship. It's not a one-to-one relationship, but there is some relationship between imposter syndrome and perfectionism. And in particular, I've wrestled with some perfectionism at times. And for a lot of my life, I didn't want to do anything unless I felt like I could do it with excellence. And that alone held me back. Like that is one of those things that voice in my head, that imposter would prey on and say, you're not going to be great at this, so you better not even try it. And what I had to learn and figure out is that sometimes you have to do things poorly in order to get good at them. Sometimes you have to do something. There's only so much you can learn from books and courses and teachers and coaches. And sometimes you just have to do it, and you have to do it poorly in order to get better at it. And so, for instance, I do some coach training. I'm on faculty at a coaching school. I train executive coaches that are, getting certified with the International Coach Federation. And one of the sayings that I use all the time is that great coaching comes from experience, and experience comes from not so great coaching. And so I tell my coaches that you have to do it in order to get better at it. You can't just listen to me talk about it. You can't even listen to me do it and think you're going to be great right out of the gate. You have to go do it, and do it even poorly, in order to build the experience that makes you great at it. And so I remind people that, if you were going to go play a sport, if you were going to go take up the sport of baseball, you wouldn't want your first baseball game to be in the World Series.
No.
And if you were going to take up, a football, you wouldn't want your first football game to be the Super Bowl, or so you would want to have some practice, and you would want to start on a smaller stage where the stakes are lower, and you would want to work out some of the kinks and figure it out, and then slowly earn your way to those big stages. And that's what you've got to think about. Even, your webinar example, you probably made some mistakes on that first webinar. You look back on it and think, I wish I'd have done that differently. Well, guess what? You did it with 3 people in the room, so it wasn't a big deal, right? Yeah. If you'd had 50 people show up to that first one, it might have been really embarrassing. It might have been, a little even more detrimental to you than you liked. You'd look back on it and go, man, I wish I had tried that with a smaller audience. Yeah. So those small beginnings should not be looked down upon. That's part of the process. And in some cases, it's a really important part of the process of mastery and becoming great at something.
Yeah, I love that. So true. So true. Let's change gears a little bit here. I wanted to ask you about the role of community. I'm going to have some follow-up questions on this, because I've actually launched a small community recently, and it's been a big learning experience for me in terms of how we manage it and how to guide the conversations that we have in here. I know you have some thoughts on this topic, so tell me about community and how that can either help or hinder the situation here.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in the power and the value of community. I'm a relationship builder. I'm connected to a lot of people. I'm in a lot of groups that I interact with, and those relationships are really, really helpful, but they can also be hurtful. And, we go back to the example of entrepreneurs, and there's lots of entrepreneurial communities and conferences and events and networking groups. And if you go into a community of entrepreneurs where everybody is in sales mode, as we talked about, everybody's got their game face on, everybody's presenting the very best version of themselves, then that community can actually work against you, because for many of the reasons we've already discussed. The comparison trap, you're there feeling like, I'm the only one who doesn't measure up, I'm the only one who doesn't belong, because there's a lack of authenticity there. There's a lack of vulnerability. But if you get into a community where there is vulnerability, where people are willing to say, hey, here's what I'm struggling with, here's what I've mastered, and here's where I'm struggling, here's the things I'm doing well, and here's what's not going so well. When you're in that kind of community, it's really, really powerful and effective. And so I've come to realize that as important as community is, vulnerability is the key that makes community work for you, or if you don't have it, it works against you. And so community without vulnerability is going to feed your imposter. It's going to make that voice louder and stronger in your mind. But community with vulnerability will starve it. It'll weaken your self-doubt. It'll take away, because you get to see that, man, everybody else is having similar struggles, or at least having their own version of these struggles as I am. And we're all on a learning journey together. And so I don't have to feel like I'm the only one who doesn't fit or doesn't measure up.
So interesting. So interesting. I think you've just helped me realize why this community is working the way it is. So let me explain to you what's going on. Part of my mission with Future Ready is, making financial education and support more accessible. And a big part of that is lowering the price of accessing it. So one of the
Yeah.
things I've been
Yeah.
experimenting with is basically group format learning. So I brought together a group of founders and said, hey, this is finance theory. This is kind of some of the basics that you need to understand. But then what we do, which as far as I know is pretty unique in this space, is everyone has opted into sharing their financial data with me. So we're not just having a conversation about, how cost of goods sold works, and we're not just having a conversation about, customer acquisition costs. I've actually got everyone's data and I put it into a graph. So everyone's performance in terms of, COGS as a percentage of sales or their advertising cost as a percentage of sales, it's right there on the screen.
Yeah.
And I think what I have done, reflecting on what you just said, is I have basically completely removed anyone's ability to pretend that there's something that they're not. Like,
Yeah.
the data's there. It shows who is vulnerable. It shows who's performing well and who's weak.
Yeah.
And, no one's performing well on every single chart.
Right.
There'll be a couple of areas where you're very strong and a couple of areas where you're very weak. And so what we do in this group is I present the data to everyone, and then I basically go around the room and ask everyone to kind of reflect on their numbers and say, okay, Kris, you're at one end of this chart and Sally, you're at the other end. How did you guys get there? Does that make sense? Does it reconcile with what you understand about your own business and each other's businesses? And I guess just kind of thinking out loud here, I mean, maybe part of the reason that this is working is because I'm basically forcing vulnerability onto these people that don't have an option other than to be vulnerable. And
you have forced the removal of the masks that people will sometimes wear by default and without even thinking about it or being intentional about it, that we hide behind that anonymity. And what you've done is removed the ability for the imposter to tell someone, everyone else here is crushing it and you're not.
Yes.
And you don't belong here. You don't belong in this group because you've got this weakness and nobody else is struggling the way you are. You've removed the ability for the imposter to tell. And I've been in rooms, Nate, where every single person in the room felt like they didn't belong. I've been in rooms where when we took a poll, I did a speech for a large major university and I spoke to all their faculty and staff. And it was about 800 or 900 people. And we took an anonymous poll, and 97% of them said they experienced imposter syndrome and felt in some way that they didn't belong or they weren't as good as everyone else around them. So when there's that ambiguity, when there's not that vulnerability, it's really easy for everybody to feel out of place. But you've created an environment where you're requiring the breaking down of those walls. And that will also be a filtering mechanism because people who don't want to get authentic and don't want to be real won't join your group. And those are the people that would be hurtful, would be harmful to the rest of the group anyway. So it's really helpful to have that requirement and make that a part of the solution that serves your members. No, it's you hit the nail on the head. There's absolutely people who I've explained this concept to, and I don't think they're ready for it, right? Yeah. And I think this relationship with finances and numbers can be particularly problematic, particularly for purpose-led founders. Because what happens with purpose-led founders is, they've got this narrative that they're telling their family and friends, they're changing the world, they're doing all these wonderful things, got this fantastic product, building this great business, but then there's often times when the numbers are telling a completely different story. Yeah. And kind of facing up to the finances and the numbers can be quite confronting. And I believe it can cause what's known as cognitive dissonance, which is that, you can't look at the numbers, which kind of suck, and also be telling this story to everyone that, oh my God, my business is amazing and everything's going great. Like one of those things, can't be true. And I have certainly had conversations with founders who I just don't think they're ready to face up to the reality of their numbers. And I suspect they've probably been scared away by this whole concept. Yeah, and they may fear that they're going to be the only one that doesn't have great numbers, which of course is not true.
Yeah.
But without knowing, it's natural to feel that way, and that's part of the battle that I've recognized and wanted to push back against. And so I've kind of come to a place where I don't want to be a part of a community where vulnerability is not the norm, where vulnerability is not celebrated, and especially if it's punished, or people that take risks and open up are hurt for it. I don't want to be part of that because it's not productive and it's not helpful.
Yeah, so true, so true. And so you're very, very selective then about the communities or groups that you choose to be a part in or a part of. I understand you may have employed some fairly creative tactics in the past in terms of, quickly figuring out whether or not a group is something that you want to be part of. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about that? Like, how can you quickly figure out whether this is going to be a vulnerable group, and whether it is worth your time to hang out and invest in it?
Yeah. So once I figured out that vulnerability is an important ingredient in what makes a community powerful, I started to use vulnerability as a test. And so what I would do is when I'm introduced to a new group, or I'm considering joining a new organization, or I'm meeting some people for the first time, I will intentionally be a little bit vulnerable to see how people react. Maybe I'll acknowledge a weakness or an area that I'm trying to grow or learn, or, I'll try to cut against the typical grain of putting your game face on and showing up as your best and, trying to impress everyone. And the way people react tells me a little bit about those individuals and the culture of the group as a whole. If people sort of start to back away and say, "Oh, I don't have that problem," or "I don't know what you're talking about," and they get, a little bit standoffish or even nervous, then I know there's a lot of faking it going on, and people are not comfortable with that level of vulnerability. But if I open up and I share something and people lean in and say, "Oh my goodness, I'm so glad you said that because I've struggled with that myself," or maybe they say, "You know what, I battled that same thing and here's what I learned, and let me introduce you to someone or give you some resources," they reward vulnerability. Then I know that this is a group that values that and where it's going to be safe. Now, this is not without risk. Okay. I want to acknowledge that up front, that if you're going to open yourself up, that you may be, some people will punish vulnerability. Some people will use your vulnerability against you. You make yourself vulnerable and you might get hurt. But I have just come to really believe that the lessons I learned, the things I learn about those people outweighs any potential negative downsides of me being vulnerable, because I know sooner rather than later that this is not a safe space. And so if I do get harmed in some way for opening up, then that's okay. It's just accelerated my learning. It's going back to that. I tried something and I didn't succeed. It wasn't the group for me, but I learned from it and I got out quickly so that I don't have to invest anything more into that organization or community. And I won't waste any of my time and energy there.
That's so clever. It's so clever. Kris, let me ask you a question. I presume you recall the LinkedIn post over which you and I connected. I'll refresh your memory, but
it's been a little bit now since we did that.
Been a couple of months.
Remind me.
I'm, as you probably noticed, Australian, and this particular post that we'd connected over was actually a post from an Australian founder. And this founder had claimed that she didn't, struggle with, or, the males in her circle were not encountering or admitting to imposter syndrome. And my basic, response was, "Hey, BS, like, go read this guy's book." And that's, how you and I got connected. Anyway, my question is, I'm curious about cultural differences. In the Australian culture, there's kind of this attitude of, "Yeah, she'll be right, mate. Just keep on going. Don't worry about it." And, there's often a reluctance, particularly in Australian males, I think, to ignore this or deny this or, confess. I mean, it's kind of, I'm just, thinking about the people that I grew up around. It's like almost a confession of weakness to admit that you're thinking this, or you're dealing with it. I'm curious whether you are aware of any differences across nationalities or cultures. Like, is this more or less prevalent in certain parts of the world?
Yeah, so I've learned a lot in this area since the book was published, and I'll confess that when I published my book in January of 2021, most of the conversations I'd had, most of the experience and discussions around this topic were with people in the U.S. where I live, and I didn't know, I wasn't 100% sure if this was sort of a cultural thing that mostly showed up in the United States, or if it had to do with, some difference there. I have since learned that this imposter syndrome, the imposter phenomenon, whatever you want to call it, but self-doubt and the prevalence of it, it crosses all kinds of boundaries, cultural, socioeconomic, geographic. I've talked to people on every continent except Antarctica that have wrestled with self-doubt. And so,
well, they do wrestle polar bears. I mean, it would make sense.
Well,
they don't have it, right?
Perhaps. Yeah. Yeah. So, but to answer your question, there are some cultural differences in how it's talked about and who's willing and more open to talk about it. So you mentioned the LinkedIn post that initially connected us, where you tagged me and brought me into the conversation, was a woman saying she didn't believe that any men dealt with imposter syndrome. And this has been a common misconception, in part because the original research done in the 1970s on the imposter phenomenon was only done on women. It was thought to just be kind of a woman in a man's world problem of this pervasive self-doubt and feeling like an imposter. But multiple studies since then have shown that men and women experience it almost equally. However, in my experience, women are a lot more willing to talk about it. And that difference between that willingness and that openness is more prevalent, or it's more extreme in cultures that are more, how shall I say, more male dominated, or where there's a lot more gender stereotypes and things like that. So I have spoken in countries on other continents that where men will privately acknowledge to me that yes, this is a thing, but they will not speak publicly about it.
Not publicly.
I've run groups. I've run communities and group coaching programs, both here in the U.S. and in other countries. And there are certain countries where men will not join those groups. They will not come and open up in the community of other men, and especially in a mixed group with men and women. Wow. So culture does play a role. And I think, to your point, it is that sort of feeling like I'm admitting a weakness or a flaw. This is what is really sinister about imposter syndrome and about self-doubt generally, is if you doubt yourself or you worry that you might be a fraud, admitting that you worry about that makes you feel more like a fraud. So the very fear you have that people are going to look at you and go, oh, you don't actually know what you're doing, you're not legit. That is the same fear that keeps you from talking about it and acknowledging that, yes, I have this self-doubt. But Nate, I can tell you that over and over and over, when I have talked to very high achieving people in private, it's incredibly prevalent. People will say, yes, I wrestle with self-doubt, but I've always been afraid to say anything about it. And I feel like society tells me I cannot show or demonstrate any form of weakness. And so from that perspective, it is different across cultures, especially where that pressure is really there to not show weakness, to not admit a fault or a flaw. But that doesn't mean it's not happening. It just means that people are not willing to talk about it. And to be really honest with you, that's one of the reasons I, as a middle-class white male, decided I should write a book on this topic to show that it's not a minority issue. It's not a women's issue. It's not an issue of poverty or any other thing. It's, I'm an American. And yet I and many other people like me wrestle with self-doubt.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in many ways, I guess the message coming from someone like you makes it all the more powerful.
Yes.
Society might look at us.
Yeah, I mean, that is exactly why I felt compelled and continue to feel compelled to speak up about this issue. And I've had many people say, thank you. I'm so glad to know that someone like you is willing to acknowledge that you have wrestled with self-doubt.
Yeah. So interesting. So you've shared a lot just now about some of the cultural and gender considerations here, and some of the places where this is less likely to show up or at least be admitted to. What about on the flip side? I mean, you've spoken to people from all over the world, from all different, corners and geographies and backgrounds, and across many different industries too. Are there any places where you've been surprised about the fact that this is showing up? And, people or parts of the world where you didn't think it would be a problem, and maybe it actually is much more prevalent than you'd anticipate?
It's a good question. And I can't think of any. And maybe that's because I've just learned enough about it to not be surprised when it shows up anywhere. I've come to understand that this phenomenon, this experience of wrestling self-doubt, it is associated with being a high achiever. And so, I've talked to fighter pilots and professional athletes and, people who perform at the highest levels in their field. And many of them say, oh yeah, I have constantly wrestled with self-doubt, or maybe not constantly, but they've definitely had periods of time on their journey where they questioned themselves and they wondered. Sometimes when you reach an elite status, there's a lot of pressure to maintain that. And that can be even more pressure than the pressure you faced trying to get there. And so the doubt can creep in all sorts of ways. And so to honestly answer your question, no, I'm not surprised by it anymore. There is almost nowhere that someone would say, yeah, I wrestle with self-doubt, and I would be shocked by that.
So interesting. Wow. Well, Kris, this has been absolutely fascinating. I'm glad we've taken this conversation from your book to LinkedIn a couple of months ago.
Yes.
To now having an opportunity to sit down with you one-on-one and learn more about this. Like I said, your work was tremendously helpful for me, and I'm so grateful to the coach who put me onto you, and then you writing the actual book. It was a real savior for me at the time, and actually reread it recently in anticipation of this interview. So I wanted to ask you, I mean, this is based on what we've talked about today. Like, this is something that's pretty much inevitable if you're an entrepreneur or a founder, that there's an incredibly high chance that, folks are going to encounter this at some point in their journey in some shape or form. Now, if we assume that the number two thing that they should do is go and read your book, but let's assume that maybe they haven't had time to do that yet. And someone's in the moment and they're dealing with a really serious bout of this right now. Are there any practical tips or strategies or tactics that you think people could put into play almost immediately to start improving their situation and feeling better about things?
Yeah, I would say the number one thing that you can do is find someone that you can trust and open up and talk about it. Often just simply talking about those feelings and the thoughts going on and the mental game that's going on in your head, talking about it sort of erodes its power. It doesn't completely eliminate it. It's not like you can have one conversation and be totally fine and walk away and it's done. But it helps a lot to talk with someone that knows your situation, that can, speak some truth to you about your qualities and your abilities. Preferably someone who's not just going to cheerlead, someone who's not just going to say, I believe in you. You're great. You're amazing. I know you can do it. But someone who can, probably not your mom. Someone who can look at you honestly and say, Nate, you've been training for this. you've worked hard to achieve this. You've been practicing. Look at all of the experience behind you that has led you to this place. And maybe it's a non-traditional route. Maybe it's not exactly what you would plan if you started from the beginning and mapped out the entire road. But all of the things you've done bring so many unique experiences that are going to equip you to do this like no one else. Someone that can look at you objectively and help you see the things you're not seeing, help you sort of overcome some of those blind spots. Yeah. And then also they can, help dispel some of those myths and lies that are going on in your head, that someone that'll help you get out of the comparison trap, quit focusing on other people, look at your journey, figure out what do you want to learn next and where are you going to go and what kind of experiments are you going to run to do that and grow. Finding a person like that, and then of course the expansion of that is a community like that. Is immensely helpful and definitely what I would say to go do right away. And then, of course, as you said, grab a copy of my book and read it cover to cover or listen to it on Audible.
Both good options. What I love about what you just mentioned was speaking to someone who can remind you of all the wonderful things you've done. And I think as an entrepreneur and founder, we're head down, we're solving problems all day. Like, it can often feel like we're just banging our head against the wall day in and day out.
Yes.
I think it often takes a very intentional, you need to have a very intentional step back or the perspective of an outside person to kind of remind you occasionally of like, you know what, you've actually done quite a lot here. You've come a remarkably long way. You've solved all of these problems already. You've already done something that, most of the population would be incapable of having done. Like, you're already a freaking rock star. Like, of course you're going to have a bad day occasionally, but don't lose sight of the bigger picture here. So I think that's super important about your message there and, gaining that perspective from people around you. So excellent suggestion. Well, thank you, Kris. This has been a fascinating conversation. I knew it would be. I've thoroughly enjoyed diving into this with you. If folks are interested in learning a little bit more about you and your work, maybe hiring you as a guest speaker at some point, which I understand you do a bit of, where should they go to learn more about you?
Yes, I am easy to find online if you can remember that my name starts with a K, Kris Kelso. And I'm at kriskelso.com. I'm Kris Kelso on most of the major social platforms. And yes, Nate, I am a professional keynote speaker. I speak on stages and at private company events and conferences, universities around the globe, and would love to speak to some of your friends in Australia as well. So looking for an opportunity to travel down there and do a gig. So let's hope we can make that happen with one of your listeners.
There's a big market in Australia. Lots of people who could use your help down there, I'm sure, I think. Anyway, Kris, thank you again. I'm going to include links below to everything you just mentioned. I'll include your webpage and social handles in the show notes if folks are keen to check that out. I'm also going to include down there a link to your book online if people are interested in listening to that or grabbing a copy. But that's it for today, folks. Kris, thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you, Nate. It's been a pleasure.